Welcome back. We're talking about why the Americans wanted to become independent. And the key to it, in the simplest phrase, is that England tried to change the way they'd run their empire forever. They'd always run it on this principle of salutary neglect. Now they're going to change that. And there will be three areas where they're going to make changes that will be relevant. The first one I talked about in the last lecture. England decided not to allow us to expand west of the Appalachians with the Royal Proclamation of 1763. That was not really that big a factor, as I said, because it affected relatively few Americans. Most people didn't care. Most people didn't want to go west of the Appalachians. The only reason was that it became an issue was because the people it did affect were some of the wealthy, influential, powerful people, especially in the Virginia House of Burgesses, who had plans for using that land that would make them a lot of money, and then those plans were all canceled. So that was one area. The second one I just introduced on the last lecture, and that was that England decided to keep troops in the western part of the North American Empire, west of the Appalachians. They decided to keep troops there as a safeguard against possible Indian rebellions. And that then would require money. And England decided to do something that it had never done before, and that was to tax the American people. And the first tax that England ever really imposed on the Americans came in 1764, when Parliament passed what was called the Sugar Act. And that imposed a tariff on the import of sugar from the British West Indies. Now, this was officially an amendment to the Molasses Act of 1733, which I talked about previously. The Molasses Act of 1763 imposed a very high tax on the import of sugar from the non-British, or what I call the foreign West Indies, places like Cuba and Haiti and the Dutch colonies and so forth. That was really not a tax. It was, on the paper it's a tax, but the purpose of it was to prohibit Americans from trading with the foreign West Indies and to enable them to trade only with the British West Indies. But A, that was not really a tax. It was not intended to raise revenue. And as we saw when we were still meeting, it was not enforceable. So it had been on the books, but it had really not made any impact. Now, 31 years later, in 1764, Parliament amended that tax, actually lowered it so that it would now be an actual tax. It's going to be at a level small enough that you can actually collect it, and it applies to the British West Indies. So it's going to apply to legal sugar and other products derived from it or related to it. So this is going to be a real tax on legal trade. It was not designed to make illegal trade. It was designed to be a source of revenue, to actually take money from the Americans and give it to the royal treasury. And it was designed to cover about a fourth of the cost of keeping the British troops in North America. Well, that act was passed in 1764, and it didn't cause much of a stir. Some of the assemblies passed resolutions criticizing it, and Parliament said, yeah, why are you complaining? It actually lowers the tax. And the American response was, yeah, but this is a real tax. It's not just a trade regulation. It's actually designed to raise revenue. So there was some go back and forth on that, and some conversation, but no real problem. But as you remember, although that's going to cover about a fourth of the cost of the troops, Parliament expected Americans to pay half of the cost of keeping the troops. The other half they're going to pay themselves. So that leaves another quarter of the cost that Parliament expects to get from the Americans. When it passed the Sugar Act, it basically told the Americans, we're going to still need to get more money out of you than this tax will produce. But take some time and let us know what you want to do. Take a year from now we'll deal with this issue again, but we'll take information from you. If you want to send us your opinions on what kind of things you want to tax, how you want to tax, what you want to do, just let us know and we'll take that into account when we decide what to do. So a year went by and there was no American response. None of the assemblies made any effort to accept the invitation of Parliament to advise on taxing. So in 1765, in the summer of 1765, Parliament passed another tax bill. This was called the Stamp Act. Now sometimes when students hear that word Stamp Act, they think it has to do with postage and mail or something like that. No. The stamp in question was not for postage. It's a little stamp that goes on a document to make it official, to make it legal. All sorts of documents had to have a stamp attached to it. And then of course the point is, the British government is going to sell the stamps, and the money that they get from that will be the revenue that they're going to get. That's the way they go about taxing. This was a common way that England itself had used forever as a tax on the English people. They had stamp taxes, stamp acts for a long time. And it's just the kind of thing that even today, if you want to have a contract legally in LA County, you have to get a official registration with the county, and the county charges a fee for registering this contract. That was sort of the way it was. It was a kind of a legal document to approve legal contracts. It also applied to all sorts of business documents. It applied to newspapers and other published documents. They all had to have a stamp on it. It applied to certain kind of religious documents such as baptismal records or marriage records. Those were not issued by the county in those days as they are today. They were just issued by churches, and they all had to have, churches would routinely issue a baptismal certificate, and that had to have a stamp on it. Certain articles such as playing cards and dice that would be just sold as consumer items also had to have a stamp on it. So it's just a way to have certain items have to have a tax, and then you have to get the tax from the government. You have to get the stamp from the government, and then when doing that you can be paying a tax. So that's the way it goes. The taxes were not very high, and probably most Americans wouldn't have occasion to do that. Most people don't need to do legal documents. Most people don't get married. Most people don't get married more than once every 2-3 years. Most people don't have to have a baptismal certificate. They don't have, they only have like maybe 4 kids every 3 years. The average American wouldn't pay very many of these, and even the people who did, businessmen who deal with this all the time, always are entering into contracts and always had to pay taxes, even them, the tax was not that high. And remember, this is going to go for revenue for the troops that are there to provide security for the Americans, to protect them against possible Indian uprisings. So, from the standpoint of Parliament, it's not that big a deal. But the American people went crazy over it. There were riots throughout the colonies. There was violence. The people whose jobs it were to sell the taxes, and these are people who are just clerks in public offices, they were assaulted, they were beaten up. A popular form of attacking the poor tax agents was tarring and feathering, which would not be fatal, but could be very painful and very disfiguring. They'd dip people in hot tar and then throw feathers on them. A very cruel punishment. And they're doing this just to ordinary tax collectors. The mobs would follow the tax collectors to their homes and threaten their families, stand outside of their homes and shout ugly things at them and threaten them with damage and threaten their families. There was other protest that was a little less violent. The colonies got together, and when I say the colonies, I mean usually their assemblies. The assemblies were in communication with one another, and they would act together. And this I find fascinating because if you remember a point I made about the war, the 7 Years' War, which was just over for a couple of years, the American colonies had refused to act in unison to fight against the French in a major world war. They just insisted on remaining each independent assembly with its militia by itself. But now, in response to the Stamp Act, they're starting to act together. They would communicate and say, what are we going to do about this? And out of that communication came a couple of things. One was a decision to boycott trade with England, to set up some sort of an agreement not to import goods from English merchants. And the theory behind that, of course, was to make business difficult for British merchants who used the Americans as some of their most important customers, and then to create economic hardship for the British merchants back in England, so they would go to Parliament and lobby to persuade Parliament to back off and not offend their customers. But another thing that came out of that communication among the assemblies was a decision to have a joint meeting where they would all come together and discuss how to respond to this. Instead of leaving each assembly to respond by itself, they decided to cooperate, work together in what they called a Congress. Now later that word came to mean something else, but as it was used in 1765, it simply means a meeting together. The Congress is just a getting together, in this case of the assemblies, and jointly deciding on a course of action to take with regard to the Stamp Act. So the Stamp Act Congress was held in New York in September of 1765. As it turned out, only 9 of the assemblies were able to send delegates to it. The other 4 were too far away. Communication is very difficult. The assemblies all had to meet, and it's hard to do that. And so in a short period of time, only 9 of the assemblies got together. They elected delegates, usually from themselves, of their own members. They'd send 4 or 5 people from each assembly, and they went to New York and they met together for what is called the Stamp Act Congress. And at that they adopted 13 resolutions or resolves. These are called the Stamp Act Resolves. They numbered 13. I don't know if that was on purpose to make it 13 or if that just turned out that way. But in the Stamp Act Resolves, they stated to England what their argument with the Stamp Act was. So this is very important to understand the points of the Stamp Act Resolves, because this says why Americans are thinking what they're thinking and why they are opposed to taxation. The key to understanding that are 4 words that you should all learn. The 4 words are no taxation without representation. To understand how they came to that, we have to understand a little bit about political philosophy at the time. Americans were all familiar with the writing of what we would today call an economist, but in those days he was called a philosopher, because all intellectual people were called philosophers, all academics. This man's name was John Locke, and he had written way back in 1691 little essays on political theory. They're called the Treatises on Civil Government. And they've been written around 1691. So John Locke never came to America. He was dead by the time any of this happened, but he's very influential. In the years since he had written those, his ideas became the standard political theory that people in the British Empire understood. Everybody sort of knew about John Locke. All people who went to college would be familiar with his work. Many of the Americans in the assemblies and so forth had been to college either in England itself. They'd gone over to England to go to school at Cambridge or Oxford, or they'd studied at some of the colleges that had been established in the colonies, such as Harvard in Massachusetts or William and Mary in Virginia. And there were a couple of others. But everybody knew about John Locke's ideas, and everybody understood the way that he explained government is supposed to work. And the main question that Locke presented in his theories was, what is the purpose of government? Why do we have governments? And he explained it that the purpose of government was to protect our natural rights. Protect what we understood to be the rights of all people. They are called natural rights. And the point is that because they come from nature, they're not granted to us by a king or a government or some authority. We have them as human beings. Everybody has these rights. We're born with them. It's part of being human. And this is familiar theory to British thinkers because we think about freedom, we talk about liberty, and we talk then about the concept of rights. This all goes together. It's all part of the way that British people, whether they're in America or in England, that British people think about government and what it does. They think about terms of rights. Normally, John Locke's theories came down to 3 words for rights. Some of you may have heard these. And they're always presented in this order. I don't know why, but they're always in this order. But the term for rights are life, liberty, and property. That's what we're there. Government is there to protect the life, liberty, and property that we are all entitled to by being human beings. We are entitled to that from nature. Those are our natural rights. And people establish governments in order to protect our rights. That's what government's all about. And then John Locke asked the question, what happens if a government fails to protect our rights? Well, you might remember the context of what was going on in England around 1691. A couple of years before, when I talked about this in class, England had had the so-called Glorious Revolution. And the point is that if a government fails to protect our rights, then you can have a revolution. And what Locke was doing, although he didn't say it in so many words, he was writing in 1691 to justify the Glorious Revolution. He was saying, in effect, that King James II had, and he didn't say this, but what he's implying is that James II had failed to protect our rights, so that the British people were within their proper area to overthrow him, have a revolution, and get another government that would protect their rights. So this is a common thinking in British thought, which Americans, as British subjects, anybody who knows anything about philosophy or who's gone to college at all, is familiar with the work of Locke, is familiar with the concept of rights and the need of a government to protect it, and the opportunity for people to have a revolution and get rid of the government if it fails to protect their rights. So what does that have to do now then with the Stamp Act? We'll have to take a break here, and I'll come back and we'll go into that.